Amber Heard has made it clear that she's no fan of religion and Christianity, and she's publicly talked about how, even though she was raised in a religious home, she knows that she'll never be religious again.
Did you have problems with your family?
And he said, baby girl, can't be an atheist. And I was like, but I am.
And in an interview with Misbehave magazine, she also said that she knows enough about Christianity and Catholicism to know that they're too absurd for her to believe in.
What? You mean she doesn't believe that she'll spend forever in heaven because God lovingly sacrificed himself to pay for the egregious, atrocious sin of her great
6.5 hours later.
great grandmother eating an apple in a garden? Wow, atheists, right?
This is bullshit.
That it is, Captain, that it is. And talking of Johnny Depp, last week we took a look at a video from John McCrae of What Do You Meme, as he dissected why precisely Johnny Depp rejects Christianity.
Hello. Do you have a moment to talk about our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ?
This time, however, we're going to take a look at why McCrae believes Amber Heard should be a Christian.
And in an interview with Misbehave magazine, she also said that she knows enough about Christianity and Catholicism to know that they're too absurd for her to believe in. But she didn't always feel this way. When she was 16, something tragic happened that led her to give up on belief in God entirely and to become an atheist. And although I truly do sympathize with what she went through and can only imagine how difficult that was, I don't believe that what happened to her should have made her an atheist, but instead, if anything, I believe that it should have made her a Christian.
Dawkins, please, you're almost as triggered as when someone told you to believe in yourself, despite there being no peer-reviewed evidence.
Show me the evidence, show me the evidence, show me the evidence, show me the evidence.
Let's hear him out, okay? Just put down your triggering, Dawkins. Let's hear him out.
When Amber was 16, she was going to a Catholic high school when things took a turn that would change her life forever. One day she learned that her best friend was involved in a car accident and unfortunately passed away. Of course this was hard on Amber, and it affected every area of her life, especially her religious views. Having a difficult time processing her friend's death, she dropped out of Catholic high school and she became an atheist at the age of 16.
Alright, so here's a question. How much of what McCrae just said is hearsay?
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
Well, we're going to get a bit tedious here, but just as McCrae asked us to hear him out, I'm going to request the same.
Just hear me out.
McCrae claims that 1. Heard became an atheist at the age of 16.
And she became an atheist at the age of 16.
And 2. She became an atheist due especially to processing her friend's death.
Of course this was hard on Amber, and it affected every area of her life, especially her religious views.
But here's the thing. None of the sources McCrae referenced establishes either of these claims. In fact, 2 of them contradict him, meaning that what he's about to critique is at best conjecture. So let's delve a little into those sources. The statement of Heard becoming an atheist at 16 due to her friend's unfortunate demise is from a Gossip article. Capitalizing on Heard's relationship with Depp, the author has spliced their own conjecture with quotes from Heard, as have many articles, and it's specifically the author's conjecture that McCrae has referenced. Second, in the Misbehave interview in which Heard says she was raised in a religious home.
Even though she was raised in a religious home, she knows that she'll never be religious again.
And in the same paragraph, no less, that McCrae quoted, she said that she's not a practicing atheist and that we should consider her agnostic, which can be seen even through the jolty editing. Now for sure, many people conflate atheism and agnosticism, and it's certainly possible that Heard is one of them. I'd suggest it's unlikely though, given that most atheists would simply point out that there are no such things as atheist practices, as opposed to rejecting the atheist label outright in favour of agnosticism. But despite this, let's assume that she was saying she's an atheist. Where's the crucial claims of 1. Her saying that she became an atheist at 16, and 2. That her friend's demise played a crucial role?
Objection, Your Honor, hearsay.
Finally, what about the clip that McCrae played? Didn't Heard state very clearly that she's an atheist?
Did you have problems with your family?
And he said, baby girl, can't be an atheist. And I was like, but I am.
That she did. But there's at least 3 things to consider. First, she didn't say she became an atheist at 16. Second, she didn't say that her friend's car crash played a significant role in her deconversion. And third, it's clear that Heard was recording a conversation with her father and was thus answering to his definition of an atheist, which might well lump agnostics and atheists together. I mean, we're all forsaken, are we not? According to most Christians, atheists and agnostics alike are bound for hell.
Do you have a moment to talk about our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ?
Now, I entirely appreciate that this might come across as nitpicky, but it's not. It is crucial. If the case that McRae is about to critique is weaved of quote mines and conjecture, then he's battling a phantom. Now fine, the phantom does represent some deconversion stories, but in the absence of establishing that Heard represents such a case, her presence serves as little more than celebrity relevance.
So specifically, what is it about this tragedy that made her stop believing in God? Well, she doesn't go into any depth in any of her interviews,
or even mention that the tragedy played any role. At least, not in the interviews that McRae referenced, and as far as I know, anywhere.
Well, she doesn't go into any depth in any of her interviews, but in order for the tragedy to lead her to the conclusion that God didn't exist, she had to believe that if God did exist, then a tragedy like that wouldn't have happened. But since the tragedy did happen, then she concluded that God didn't exist. Now, this may shock you, but in a way, I agree with her here. If she's right in her assumption that God wouldn't allow tragedies to occur.
So, according to McRae, not only did Heard become an atheist at 16 due to her friend's tragic death, but she also did so on the assumption that if God existed, then we wouldn't have any tragedies.
If she's right in her assumption that God wouldn't allow tragedies to occur, then she would be right to conclude that God didn't exist after learning about the tragedy of her friend. The only problem that I have with that is I just don't think she's right to think that we shouldn't expect tragedies to occur if God existed. For me, here's one way that I think about it. The other day, actually, I was thinking about my son's first trip to the dentist, which was a disaster.
Okay, so here comes the greater good theodicy, and in its extremely popular dental analogy package, no less. Given this, we ought to get the problem of evil firmly on the table. Under the standard conception of God in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, God is all-loving, and so he wants to prevent suffering and injustice. He's also all-powerful, so he has the means to stop suffering and injustice. And he's all-knowing, so he knows when and where suffering is occurring, meaning that he has the opportunity to intervene. And yet, despite this, evil exists. Or put another way, God has the motive, means, and opportunity to prevent suffering and injustice, and yet suffering and injustice endure. Now, these four propositions either are, or seemingly are, incompatible, and a theodicy is an attempt to show that all four of these claims are actually compatible. And that brings us to McRae, who's about to give us the greater good theodicy, which states that suffering and injustice in the world serve a greater good. You know, it's like spending money to make money. Let's hear it.
The other day, actually, I was thinking about my son's first trip to the dentist, which was a disaster. When the dentist came in, as usual, he was trying to make my son happy and trying to make him laugh, but my son was just not having it that day. So after a few minutes of the dentist trying to calm him down, my son starts screaming and kicking and crying even more, and he looked at me and he reached up to me for me to save him. But instead of grabbing him and running out of the front door, I actually had to hold him down so that way the dentist could continue to look inside of his mouth. Now keep in mind, not only could my son not understand why I didn't save him while he was reaching out to me, but he also couldn't understand why I actually had to hold him down and allowed him to suffer. I wanted him to understand that this was for the greater good, but I knew that he couldn't even understand because he wasn't even capable of understanding basic language at this point, let alone the greater concept of the greater good. But just because he couldn't comprehend the fact that there was a greater good that came from it, did that mean that I didn't have a greater good in mind? Of course not. So in a similar way, for me, I don't see why it couldn't be the same with God. If God created the entire universe and he literally knows everything that there is to know, then he would also know how everything has to happen in order to achieve the greater good, even if I can't see or comprehend it.
Well, there we have it, folks. The greater good theodicy, in which any and all tragedies, yes, all tragedies, are actually for the best.
Calling yourself a community that cares.
Oh, but we do care, Nicholas.
It's all about the greater good.
The greater good.
As the philosopher Sean Klein puts it, according to this theodicy, God is not evil because the suffering and injustice in the world serve some greater good. A dentist who has to pull a patient's infected tooth causes pain and suffering. But since this is done for the greater good, it's not an evil act. Similarly, God causes the pain and suffering in the world, but these serve some greater good, and so it doesn't count as evil. Or to frame this in a way that's perhaps a bit more palatable to theists, God allows pain and suffering in the world because it serves a greater good. Omnipotence doesn't require the ability to actualize the logically impossible, and greater good responses make use of this insight by arguing that some greater goods cannot be instantiated without also permitting evil. Thus, the proponent must insist, as McRae is doing here, that the poor 16-year-old who tragically lost all of her opportunities, they were torn from her as she died in a violent car crash, that was for the best, that was for the greater good.
This is bullshit.
How's that for loving Christian words? Well, that is what the theodicy commits you to.
How can this be for the greater good?
The greater good.
And further still, this Christian love is just, it's just something else. If the victim wasn't a Christian, then, according to traditional Christianity, she's probably in hell, isn't she? Again, just the Christian love is just, I don't know how Amber isn't convinced of this.
How can this be for the greater good?
The greater good.
Shut it!
Now, because I know how the internet gets, just to be clear, the point of the story is not comparing the event of my son going to the dentist with Amber's friend dying. That's not the point of the comparison.
But it is, though. That is the very core of the greater good theodicy. It renders all apparent evils, from minor dental inconvenience to the extermination of millions, as equally mere illusions of evil.
The point of the comparison is just to highlight how limited our minds are, and why it's not true that just because we can't think of a greater good for why God would allow something to happen, it doesn't mean that God doesn't have a greater good in mind.
Precisely. You are comparing your son's dental visit to the tragic death of a teenager. Both events are, due to how limited our minds are, seemingly acts of gratuitous evil. But, actually, they're not acts of gratuitous evil, since they serve a greater good.
It doesn't mean that God doesn't have a greater good in mind.
So with respect, McRae, if you want to bite this theodicy, then you're gonna swallow it. Just as your son couldn't understand you permitting the dentist drilling into his teeth, Heard couldn't understand, if we assume your conjecture, God permitting the tragic death of her friend. And just as you held your son down as it was necessary to achieve a greater good, God held Heard's friend in that car to achieve a greater good. That is the price of this theodicy, and it is quite the faith. From here, McRae goes on to take Heard's logic and flip it on its head in favour of Christianity.
If she's intellectually consistent, then that means that if tragedies are expected on Christianity, then that would of course be evidence that Christianity is true.
And we'll get to this in just a second. First, though, I want to provide a couple of objections to the greater good theodicy, if only to provide food for thought. Suppose that McRae witnessed the tragedy of Heard's friend and was in a position to save her life with no harm to himself. Well, according to the greater good theodicy, he's rendered impotent. He wouldn't know that saving her is the right thing to do, since saving her might prevent a greater good from happening. And the same is true of any and all seeming tragedies and injustices. Now, to be clear, this reductio doesn't provide the proponent of the greater good theodicy reason to forfeit their position, but it does provide reason for them to cease intervening on any and all apparent states of suffering, evil, and injustice. And as a second objection, I'll quote Bruce Little, Professor of Philosophy of Religion at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. The greater good seems to place the Christian in the position of showing the good that obtained from the evil, an inductive approach. This is especially true with such evils as Stalin's slaughter of upwards to 60 million people. If the good is always larger than the evil, then surely no one should have missed the good. But alas, it is not so, as we cannot point to any sizable good in that case. The greater good denies that any evil/suffering is possibly gratuitous, that all evil and suffering has a purpose which is some greater good. If this is so, then we should be able to show the evidence that supports the claim. This, I think, cannot be done, and hence undermines the greater good explanation. And to apply this further, consider the astronomical amount of suffering inflicted upon the world due to mass extinctions that occurred way before the dawn of humankind. What of the billions of sentient creatures that suffered? Why? Why so much suffering and injustice? To presume that this is all for the best is a faith that strikes me as so insanely immoral that I genuinely struggle to take this theodicy seriously.
How can this be for the greater good? The greater good. Shut it!
Now, of course, there are various responses to both of these objections, but my purpose here isn't to explore them. I'll likely create a whole video for this on rationality rules in the near future. For now, though, let's get back to McRae.
So now the question is Given the reasoning that she used in order to conclude that Christianity was false, given her standards, what would it take to prove that Christianity is true? If we shouldn't expect for any tragedies to happen if Christianity were true, then she would be right that tragedies would be evidence that Christianity is false.
So now her view is that if specifically Christianity were true, then we shouldn't expect any tragedies to occur.
But if she's intellectually consistent, then that means that if tragedies are expected on Christianity, then that would of course be evidence that Christianity is true.
Are not tragedies expected in every worldview, and thus offer no special favour to Christianity? I mean, naturalism, for instance, not only expects tragedies, but has no problem at all accounting for gratuitous evil. Naturalism does a far better job of explaining all of the suffering that permeates and envelops us.
And one way this can be shown is if Christianity teaches the concept of the greater good at its core. Let's consider the facts. So to start, Christianity is based on Jesus, and Jesus said, "In this life we will have trouble." So we should expect tragedy to occur in life according to Jesus. But rather than quoting Jesus and other verses, even more significantly, at the core of Christianity, it's not just based on the life and resurrection of Christ, but also on the tragic death of Christ.
The problem with this loose comparison, though, is that Jesus didn't die. Not only did he resurrect, according to Christians, but he's God and thus lives forever. Jesus is king, is he not? Herd's friend, on the other hand, died. She's gone. And again, if she wasn't a Christian, that is, if she wasn't convinced by a few propositions, then she's at best gone forever. And at worst, she's in hell.
It's here that we see the fulfillment of that greater good concept. It was through one man's tragic death that the greatest conceivable good came about, salvation as a free gift to those who accept it.
And what of those who don't accept it, which more accurately means those who are simply not convinced by the arguments? They're not bad people, they're simply not convinced by the arguments. What of them? Of course, eternal damnation. Hence, the greatest possible good necessitates the eternal damnation of most human beings. Yeah, that's a faith that makes me nauseous.
From his suffering and death came our ability to live eternally without suffering and death.
But only if you sufficiently grovel and are convinced of a set of propositions that are frankly very unlikely to be true.
This means that at its core, Christianity is the ultimate example of God using tragedy in order to accomplish the greatest good. And it's because of this that we can trust that a greater good will come from tragic events that we see and experience in our lifetime.
Right. So again, you were comparing the tragic death of a teenager to your son's dental visit.
So if that being said, if we were to accept Amber's mindset that she used in rejecting Christianity, then we could confidently say that if tragedies occurring prove anything about Christianity, rather than proving it false, instead, they would actually only prove that Christianity is true.
Again, it wasn't her mindset. This is all hearsay and conjecture. More to the point, though, if your faith is so strong as to interpret any tragedy as evidence of God, I can't save you, and neither can Jesus.
And something similar can be said for Amber's ex, Johnny Depp, who also became an atheist at a young age, but for very different reasons. However, I think that Johnny's reasons also should have led him to accept Christianity rather than rejecting it. So go ahead and click on this video to see what I mean, and I'll see you over there.
And on this final note, if you fancy seeing my response to McRae on Depp, then please see the link in the description. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and YouTube members. All the coffee you supply me with is, indeed, for the greater good. The greater good.